Step up, plant your feet firmly. Hello, boys. They made television history as Ralph Cramden and Ed Norton, the loudmouth bus driver and the lovable sewer worker who brought the Honeymooners to life. Their chemistry was electric, their timing impeccable, and together they became one of the most iconic comedy duos of all time. But off-camera, things were far less perfect. In the scenes, tension simmered, egos clashed, and a quiet resentment began to grow. So why did Art Carney, one of television's most gifted comedians, walk away from Jackie Gleason, never to work closely with him again? The answer has been buried for decades, but today we are finally pulling back the curtain. When the Honeymooners first aired in the mid-1950s, it felt like lightning in a bottle. Jackie Gleason was already a household name known for his booming voice and commanding presence. But it was Art Carney playing the quirky and gentle Ed Norton who gave the show its heart. Their comedic rhythm was unmatched. Gleason's explosive energy bounced perfectly off Carney's soft-spoken charm, creating a balance that felt effortless. Audiences adored them. They laughed, cried, and saw themselves in the working-class struggles of Ralph and Norton. On screen, they were brothers in spirit, but backstage, things were far more complicated. Carney had no interest in the fame or attention that Gleason thrived on. He was a quiet man, deeply private, and uncomfortable with the Hollywood machine. While Gleason soaked up the spotlight, Carney often slipped out the back door after tapings, avoiding parties, interviews, or anything that felt too flashy. It was not that he was ungrateful. He simply saw acting as a job, not a lifestyle. And working with someone as demanding and larger than life as Jackie Gleason, that came with a price. Despite their success, subtle tensions began to emerge. Gleason, known for his perfectionism, often insisted that scenes be done his way, right down to the smallest detail. Carney, who was a natural improviser, found himself boxed in. Gleason would rewrite sketches, direct the performances, and demand reshoots if something felt even slightly off. Carney never complained publicly, but those close to him said he began to feel stifled, like a supporting player in someone else's empire. Still, he stayed. The show was too beloved to abandon, and their performances remained magnetic. But as the cameras rolled and the laughs echoed through living rooms across America, Carney's quiet discomfort grew louder behind the scenes. The perfect pair? To the audience? Yes. With Art Carney, it was already becoming clear. There was nothing perfect about standing in Jackie Gleason's shadow. Jackie Gleason was not just the star of the Honeymooners, he was the architect. He created the concept, hand-picked the cast, and kept a firm grip on every aspect of the production. To many, that control is what made the show a success. But to those who worked closely with him, especially Art Carney, it often felt like walking a tightrope. Gleason's ego was legendary. He believed in his talent, and to his credit, he often delivered. But that self-assuredness came with a heavy price for anyone who had to share the stage. Gleason was notorious for resisting outside direction. He rarely rehearsed. Instead, he expected his castmates to adapt to his instincts in real time, something Carney could manage, but not without frustration. Carney was a trained performer who valued structure, rhythm, and subtlety. Gleason thrived on chaos. He would change lines last minute, adjust blocking without notice, or even cancel tapings altogether if he felt something was off. For a performer like Carney, who respected the craft deeply, this unpredictability was exhausting. What made it worse was the credit, or lack of it. While the public saw Carney as an equal half of the comedic duo, behind the scenes, Gleason soaked up the spotlight. Promotional materials often emphasized Gleason's name alone. Interviews focused on his vision, his writing, his genius. Carney, despite winning an Emmy for his role, was treated like a supporting act to Gleason's one-man show. There were no public complaints from Carney. He was too dignified for that. But his close friends have since shared that he was deeply hurt by the way his contributions were overshadowed. Even in the writer's room, Gleason made sure everything flowed through him. Scripts were filtered, jokes were reworked, and timing was dictated, all with Jackie's final approval. Carney, who had a gift for improvisation and physical comedy, was rarely allowed to veer from the script. He often said that the most creative moments on the show came not from rehearsal, but from happy accidents. But those moments became fewer as Gleason tightened his grip. The audience never saw it. All they saw was magic on screen. But the man behind Ed Norton was quietly becoming more and more disillusioned. Being under Gleason was like walking in someone else's shadow, no matter how brightly you shined. And for a man as humble and gifted as Art Carney, that shadow was beginning to feel suffocating. Art Carney and Jackie Gleason may have made millions laugh together, but off stage they could not have been more different. Carney was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and introspective, a man who found peace in quiet conversations and long walks with his wife. Gleason, on the other hand, was bombastic, unpredictable, and always performing, even when the cameras were off. He lived large, drank heavily, and surrounded himself with an entourage of admirers. Carney found that lifestyle exhausting. He had no desire to be part of the circus Gleason seemed to crave. The tension between them was not always loud. It simmered beneath the surface. Carney rarely raised his voice or made demands, but those who knew him said he felt increasingly out of sync with the chaos surrounding Gleason. The long taping days, the last-minute changes, the drinking, the shouting, it wore him down. Gleason's confidence often veered into arrogance, and while Carney tried to stay professional, he began to feel more like an employee than a creative partner. Gleason rarely expressed appreciation. Compliments were scarce. When Carney delivered a brilliant performance, Gleason might simply nod and move on. Over time, that silence began to feel pointed. Carney never needed applause, but he wanted to feel seen, respected. Instead, he felt like a pawn in Gleason's empire, used, brilliant, but ultimately dismissed. And the more success they had, the more isolated Carney felt. Adding to the strain was Carney's own struggle with anxiety. He had battled nerves for years, even before the Honeymooners made him famous. The stress of working with such an unpredictable force only intensified that inner turmoil. He began to dread rehearsals. The joy that performing once brought him was slipping away, replaced by tension and exhaustion. At times, he would go silent for long stretches, retreating inward while Gleason stormed through the set like a general preparing for war. Despite all this, Carney never lashed out. He showed up, hit his marks, and delivered performances that are still studied today. But inside, he was fading. The man who brought warmth, timing, and grace to one of the most iconic sitcom roles in history was quietly unraveling, and while fans saw laughter and brotherhood, the truth was far more complicated. The distance between Carney and Gleason was growing, and a breaking point was closer than anyone realized. There is a moment in television history that almost never happened. According to several production insiders, during the original 39-episode run of The Honeymooners, Art Carney came dangerously close to walking off the show for good. The trigger? A behind-the-scenes blow-up that remains one of the best-kept secrets in classic television lore. Though both men kept their lips sealed publicly, whispers from those on set paint a vivid picture, one where Gleason's overbearing nature finally pushed Carney to his breaking point. The exact details remain murky, but the story goes like this. During a particularly tense rehearsal, Gleason scrapped an entire scene that Carney had worked hard to shape. The scene, which featured a rare emotional beat for Ed Norton, was cut without warning. Gleason dismissed it as unnecessary. Carney, already feeling minimized, reportedly walked off the set in frustration. It was one of the few times he allowed his emotions to show. Crew members described the atmosphere as frozen. Everyone was waiting to see if he would return. He did, but something shifted that day. Carney's demeanor cooled. The warmth and camaraderie that once existed between the two men seemed to vanish overnight. From then on, Carney treated the show as work, nothing more. No more small talk with Gleason between takes. No more shared laughs during breaks. It was professionalism, plain and simple. In the years that followed, Gleason would occasionally try to bring Carney back for reunion shows or special episodes. Sometimes Carney agreed, but only briefly. And each time, it was clear that the bond they once had was long gone. They would share the screen, deliver their lines, and part ways with little more than a handshake. No warmth, no lingering conversations. Just business. Friends of Carney say he never fully recovered from how that original run ended. He had poured his soul into the role of Ed Norton, only to feel erased from the legacy he helped build. Gleason continued to be hailed as the genius behind the show, while Carney quietly moved on to other projects, rarely speaking about the Honeymooners in interviews. It was not bitterness, it was disappointment. He had hoped for mutual respect, a partnership. What he got was a reminder that in Gleason's world, there was room for only one star. This turning point, this silent fallout, became the defining crack in their relationship. And although it was never made public, it explained everything that came after. The awkward reunions, the quiet tension, and ultimately, the permanent distance between two of television's most iconic figures. As the years went by and nostalgia for the Honeymooners only grew, television producers and networks repeatedly tried to recapture the magic. Cases were proposed, tributes were filmed, and reunion segments were pitched, most of which hinged on one thing, bringing Jackie Gleason and Art Carney back together. On paper, it made perfect sense. They were legends, after all. But every time the two men were in the same room, it became painfully clear. Whatever friendship they once had was long gone. One of their most well-known reunions took place in the late 1970s, during a television special designed to honor Gleason's contributions to comedy. Carney appeared alongside him, dressed once again as Ed Norton. The moment should have felt warm, even triumphant. Instead, it was stiff. The energy between them was formal, not friendly. Gleason cracked jokes, mostly aimed at himself, but occasionally at Carney's expense. Carney smiled politely, but said very little. For longtime fans watching at home, it felt off, like the spark had gone out. Those who were present backstage have since said that Carney arrived quietly, kept to himself, and left as soon as his segment was finished. There were no heartfelt embraces, no reminiscing about old times, just a quiet performance from a man who had already emotionally checked out. And while Gleason continued to speak highly of Carney in public, the compliments often sounded more like self-congratulations. He would praise Carney as a performer, but always in a way that looped back to his own brilliance. Even in later interviews, Carney remained tight-lipped. When asked about Gleason, he gave short, respectful answers. He never attacked him, never told his side of the story, but that silence spoke volumes. It was clear that the old wounds had never healed. One close friend of Carney's once said, "Art didn't hold grudges, he just let people go." Body language during these reunions said what words never did. Gleason would lean in, command the room, and look for laughs. Carney, reserved and distant, would shrink into the background. It was a stark contrast to their days on the Honeymooners, when their comedic timing was so perfectly in sync that it seemed telepathic. Now they felt like strangers, wearing the costumes of their past selves. These reunions were brief, and they became increasingly rare. By the early 1980s, Carney was almost entirely removed from Gleason's world. He had moved on, not out of spite, but because he no longer found any joy in pretending. The resentment, though never loud or dramatic, lingered beneath every forced smile. It was not hate. It was disappointment, deeply rooted and impossible to ignore. While Jackie Gleason remained a public figure long after the Honeymooners, relishing the spotlight and taking on new projects, Art Carney took a very different path. He stepped away from the limelight, choosing a life of privacy and quiet reflection. His decision was not driven by bitterness. It was a deeply personal choice, shaped by years of silent battles with anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion. Fame had never been his goal. In fact, it often made him uncomfortable. Behind the scenes, Carney had been fighting demons for years. In the early 1960s, not long after the peak of the Honeymooners, he suffered a complete mental and emotional breakdown. Friends say he collapsed under the pressure of constant attention, high expectations, and the emotional toll of working in an environment where he never felt fully respected. He checked into a psychiatric facility and spent months recovering, a period of his life he rarely spoke about in public. When he emerged, he was changed, not broken, but more guarded, more selective about who he let into his world. Carney later spoke in vague terms about the toll that toxic work environments had taken on him. He never named names, but his words were clear. He said he learned the hard way that talent did not always equal kindness, and that the entertainment industry could be deeply isolating. Those who knew him best understood exactly who and what he meant. Jackie Gleason was never mentioned directly, but the shadow of their history hung over every pause. Unlike Gleason, Carney rarely pursued interviews or press opportunities. He took smaller roles in film and television, eventually earning critical acclaim, and even an Academy Award in 1975 for Harry and Tonto. It was a quiet, deeply moving performance that showed the full range of his talent, free from the oversized presence of Gleason. That win was not just a career milestone, it was personal validation. For once, Art Carney was recognized not as someone's sidekick, but as a powerful artist in his own right. Despite the accolades, he remained intensely private. He lived in a modest home, spent time with family, and often retreated into nature. He avoided industry events and rarely gave speeches. When he did speak, he was humble and gracious, but always measured. The wounds from his earlier years had not made him bitter, but they had made him cautious. He did not chase praise or attention. He had learned that those things could vanish the moment you stopped being useful to someone more powerful. Those close to Carney say he never looked back with regret about cutting ties with Gleason. He knew it had to be done for his mental health, his peace of mind, and his dignity. He never made a public spectacle of the fallout, never sold stories or aired grievances. He simply walked away and stayed away. In a town obsessed with fame and feuds, that kind of quiet exit was almost unheard of. But for Art Carney, it was the only way to protect the parts of himself that Gleason could never see or understand. As Jackie Gleason aged, his once larger-than-life persona began to fade. The man who had dominated television screens with confidence and swagger in the 1950s entered his later years battling serious health issues. Decades of heavy drinking and an indulgent lifestyle caught up to him. By the mid-1980s, Gleason was in declining health, reportedly suffering from a host of illnesses, including diabetes and cancer. For many fans, it was hard to watch the Great One shrink from the boisterous, commanding figure he had once been. But behind the scenes, there was something else haunting Gleason: unfinished business. In private conversations, he is said to have expressed regrets, not about his success, but about the relationships he had fractured along the way. And according to several close friends, Art Carney was near the top of that list. Gleason reportedly wanted to reach out to apologize, to mend what had long been broken. But whether it was pride, fear, or simply timing, that moment of reconciliation never came. Carney, by that time, was long removed from the television world. He was living quietly, far from the chaos of show business. He had no interest in reopening old wounds or pretending things were fine for the sake of public appearances. When he heard of Gleason's declining health, he did not comment publicly. There was no tribute, no press statement. Carney mourned the man in silence, if he mourned him at all. One of his longtime friends later said, Art had already buried that relationship years before Jackie ever passed. When Gleason died in 1987, tributes poured in from fans and celebrities alike. The television industry honored him as a pioneer, a comic genius, and a groundbreaking entertainer. But Carney's absence was noticeable. He did not attend the funeral. He made no media appearances. The silence was deafening and intentional. It was not an act of disrespect. It was an act of peace. Carney had made his decision long ago, and even in Gleason's final days, he saw no reason to rewrite the past. Those closest to both men understood the truth. Gleason had burned bridges throughout his career, most of which he never repaired. He could be warm and generous one moment, cold and cutting the next. For some like Carney, that kind of volatility was not worth the toll it took on the soul. And while Gleason may have wanted forgiveness, he waited too long to ask for it. Their story ends not with a dramatic confrontation or heartfelt reunion, but with a quiet, unresolved distance. Two men who created magic together, but who let pride and pain stand between them for the rest of their lives. In the end, it was not hatred that kept them apart. It was the simple truth that sometimes even the deepest connections cannot survive the cost of one-sided respect. In the world of entertainment, some partnerships shine so brightly that audiences never imagined there could be darkness behind the scenes. Jackie Gleason and Art Carney gave us one of those rare, timeless pairings. As Ralph Kramden and Ed Norton, they made millions laugh, inspired generations of comedians, and left a permanent mark on television history. But behind the applause and accolades was a story far more complicated. A story of quiet resentment, misaligned values, and a deep emotional divide that was never repaired. Art Carney never sought to rewrite the past or make public declarations about what went wrong. He chose silence, not out of weakness, but out of strength. For him, dignity was more important than drama. He knew his worth, even if it was not always acknowledged. While Gleason continued to dominate headlines and be celebrated for his genius, Carney found peace in stillness, in family, and in a life lived on his own terms. Their fractured relationship remains one of the great what-ifs in television history. What if Gleason had acknowledged Carney's contributions more openly? What if they had shared the spotlight as equals? What if that apology had come in time? We will never know, but perhaps that is what makes their story so powerful. It reminds us that behind every iconic image is a reality shaped by human flaws.